I'm Cornell Clayton, Director of the Foley Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our event today. This is one of our ongoing events surrounding the 2024 election. Before I introduce our guest today, let me remind you we have another event tomorrow. We have Terry Gibbons from the University of British Columbia who will be talking about race and the election. So I encourage you to come to that as well. But today we're fortunate to have with us Lilliana Mason. She is the SNF Agora Institute Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. That's a long title.
Yeah, that's
right. She is the author of several books. The two most important is the author of Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity. And she's also co-authored with Nathan Calmo, Radical American Partisanship, Mapping Violent Hostility, Its Causes and the Consequences for Democracy. Lilliana's research on American social polarization and political violence has been published in all the leading journals in political science, such as the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science. She's also regularly featured on such outlets as the Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times, and her work is currently being sponsored by with a Carnegie Fellowship. Now, I'll just point out this is her second appearance at the Foley Institute. She spoke during COVID, actually, on Zoom. And so we're very, very fortunate to have with us today Lilliana Mason. Join me in welcoming her to the Foley Institute.
Giving myself a timer. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great opportunity for me to talk to everyone. I only have 2 books. The third one is in process. But what I'm going to talk about today is the focus really of my second book, which came out in 2022. And that book was sort of the outcome of a conversation that I had with Nathan Calmo, who's my co-author. At the time, we actually met at a conference, and I at the time was writing my first book, which was about how social identities affect and interact with American partisanship to make Democrats and Republicans dislike one another. And I was asking questions like, how would you feel if someone from the other party moved in next door to you? Or how would you feel if your child married someone from the other party? And Nathan, at the same time, was working on his first book called With Ballots and Bullets about how partisanship structured the violence of the American Civil War. So he was focused on a lot more extreme kind of attitudes than I was. And in our conversation, we decided we started asking the question, I wonder if the questions that I'm asking are not getting at the depth and extremity of how Republicans and Democrats feel about each other. And should we be asking more extreme questions? A lot of our American politics colleagues told us we shouldn't because it doesn't matter. Americans don't think these things. Americans don't approve of violence, and they don't dehumanize one another. So we asked the questions anyway, and we've been collecting data on this now since 2017, at least one survey every single year, usually more than that. So I want to start off by just by saying, what we know already about American partisanship and American polarization in politics is that we have already been sorted. So Democrats and Republicans have become more different from each other in terms of racial identity, in terms of religious identity. Ideology does function as an identity as well. People who think of themselves as liberals or think of themselves as conservatives can identify with that group. Obviously, partisan identities, being a Democrat or Republican, and also place, right? Geographically, we have segregated ourselves from our political opponents. And so that was the basis on which I wanted to build this talk, is that we have all of these really powerful identities that are influencing our politics. And that doesn't necessarily just mean that we don't like each other. It can mean a lot more extreme and complex sets of attitudes. So Nathan and I decided to start measuring. The first concept that we wanted to measure is what we call moral disengagement. This is a set of attitudes. So the top left is people in the other party are a threat to the United States and its people. People in the other party are not just bad for politics, they're downright evil. And people in the other party don't deserve to be treated like humans because they behave like animals. These are questions that we found from social psychology, the study of intergroup conflict. In places where mass violent events have occurred, these types of attitudes are prevalent. It's not that these types of attitudes always lead to violence, but every time there is mass violence, it's because a large number of people hold these types of attitudes about their opponents or people who are not like them. Now, we went into this sort of wondering what we were going to find. We had no real idea how many people we expected to hold these types of attitudes. But what we found was that in 2017, about 60% of Democrats and Republicans thought the other party was a threat. That sort of went up and down throughout the Trump administration and then the Biden administration, basically settling around 60 to 70% in our most recent. This is actually a 2020, it doesn't say it, but it's 2023 wave of data is the final point. Considering the other party to be evil, we started out at around 40% of Democrats and Republicans believing this, and then ended up, closer to 50% by the fall of 2023, with again some movement over time. The red line is Republicans, and the blue line is Democrats. And then dehumanization, which we really weren't sure. We were hoping we would find very little of this, but what we found was about 20% of partisans in 2017 were willing to say that the other party is subhuman, and that has kind of slightly gone up to around 30%. And even above 40% at a certain point in time, that was actually around the Trump impeachment among Republicans. So these are attitudes that are worrisome. We don't necessarily want, we have two political parties, and that allows us to have a very strong sense of us versus them in our politics. In multi-party systems, we tend to think about people in other parties as not necessarily always them, right? We have parties in multiple parties, we can have coalitions, we can have different arrangements of power. In the US, because we only have two parties, it makes this us versus them divide really, really potent. One thing we wanted to know about what drives these types of attitudes, and we looked at a lot of different things that were correlated with these attitudes. And one thing that we found was that people who are, probably not surprisingly, people who are strongly identified with their party are more likely to hold these attitudes about people in the other party. And the way that we measure that is asking, like, so if you're a Republican, we say, when you talk about Republicans, you say we rather than they. And other items similar to that. The other thing that actually increases these attitudes is just aggressiveness, just an aggressive personality. So people who say that they've been in a fist fight before, people who say they get angry easily, those types of people are more willing to agree with these types of items. But one thing that we really found to be central, and in some cases the most powerful predictor, is a concept called racial resentment, which is a scale of basically 4 items that has been around in political science since the 1980s. And basically it includes a number of questions about whether Black Americans are economically not as well off as white Americans because of systemic racism, or because of some cultural deficiency, which is a real set of attitudes. I don't want to touch that, that's right. And what we found is that, so this is, here, I'll show you, this is basically, along here is levels of racial resentment along the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the level of moral disengagement from people in the other party. So this line going up is Republicans. And what this means is that for Republicans, the more racially resentful they are, the more they're willing to dehumanize and vilify Democrats. For Democrats, it's actually slightly the opposite. It's not as steep, but it is the opposite relationship, where it's Democrats who are the lowest in racial resentment are the most likely to dehumanize and vilify Republicans. And so this particular dynamic seems to be relatively central to why Democrats and Republicans are disliking one another so much. Partly because what they are arguing about is something that is deeply difficult, is a difficult topic to discuss. We have not historically been very good at talking about racial equality in the US without, in sort of like a common collected way. And this is increasingly what we see Democrats and Republicans disagreeing over. We have a sort of similar thing with sexism. This sexism scale is it's a few items, including women complain too much about inequality. Men are the real ones who are suffering in American society. And for Democrats, we don't see the same relationship, but for Republicans, we see the same thing. So the Republicans who are high in hostile sexism are the most likely to dehumanize and vilify Democrats. For Democrats, it doesn't really matter. Whatever their level of hostile sexism is doesn't affect how they feel about Republicans. But again, at least for Republicans, we see that what seems to be part of their ability to dehumanize and vilify their political opponents is their sense that, basically women are complaining too much and are harming the status of men. Again, also note here, the average scores on this scale, so on a 0 to 1 scale, Democrats score about 0.3, Republicans score about 0.6. So part of this is that on average, Republicans have higher levels of hostile sexism, but for them it's also consistent with their attitudes about Democrats. Now, why do we study these attitudes? Partly because we were worried about violence. We were worried about and wondering about whether or not Americans approve of political violence or just using violence to achieve their political goals. And so we asked those questions too. The top left is it okay to threaten regular people from the other party on the internet in a way that makes them feel frightened? Right here on the right is it okay to send violent threats to people, to leaders of the opposing party? And then this is just to what extent is violence acceptable in achieving your political goals? So these are lower numbers, which is a good thing. Basically, when we talk about threatening other people, it seems to range between 10% up to like 25% of people thinking it's okay to threaten regular folks in the electorate. Threatening leaders, again, 10% to in one point 30% among Republicans. These spikes that we see for the threats is generally around the two impeachments of Donald Trump. So it does seem like these attitudes respond to political events. And then just sort of general approval of violence. Again, below 10%. It was actually around 7% in 2017. Clearly going up after January 6th. Especially for Republicans, and then by the fall of 23, kind of coming back down to the level that it was with Democrats. So it does seem like there is, 10% of Americans, 20% of Americans, those are not great numbers of people who think that violence might be a useful tool for achieving political goals. It does correspond to many millions of Americans who think this. These are representative samples of the American electorate, and so basically this is something that we've been keeping an eye on. We're still measuring this. I'm still collecting data on these attitudes, but really what we wanted to know is how did these attitudes about social equality interact with these sort of more worrisome, hostile, partisan attitudes. And so another thing that I've been looking at is this other type of sorting. It's not sorting around what your identity is and who you are. It's sorting around what you think other people should be doing. So what you think other groups, traditionally marginalized groups, how they should, where they should fit on the social hierarchy, how much political power they should have, what does a real American look like? Those types of questions are increasingly dividing Democrats and Republicans. So going back to that racial resentment scale that I talked about before, this is white Democrats and Republicans. Red is Republicans. If you go back to 1986, white Democrats and Republicans were basically the same on racial resentment. They had basically the same level of racial resentment, which was above the middle point. It was around 0.6. By 2020, what we see is that Republicans either stay the same or get a little bit slightly more racially resentful, while white Democrats become extremely more progressive very, very rapidly, especially around the election of Barack Obama. And this divide is not only seen in levels of racial resentment, we also see it, this is from 538, this is the share of respondents who say racial discrimination is the main reason Black people can't get ahead in America. The gap between Democrats and Republicans in 1994 was 13%, and by 2020 it was 55%. So this is a divide that's been happening over the last few decades. And what we're seeing in terms of these more extreme attitudes is that this is part of the reason why we hold those extreme attitudes. Because people who disagree about whether racial discrimination basically exists it's a very difficult place to find a compromise. It's very difficult for us to have a conversation about racial inequality and stay objective and calm and not get worked up. And so this kind of trend is part of the process. We've also seen things change in terms of women's role in society. So the American National Election Study has been asking this one question. Basically, some people feel that women should have an equal role with men in running business, industry, and government. Others feel that a woman's place is in the home. Where would you place yourself on this scale? And between 1970 and 2008, they asked this question of everybody in all of their surveys. This is the American National Election Survey. It's a survey that's done every election year, and the data are free online if you want to download them. It's kind of fun to work with. So what we saw is that between 1970 and 2008, the trend was towards people basically saying, women should have an equal role with men in running business, industry, and government. And it actually was so commonly an attitude that was so commonly held that they stopped asking the question in 2008 because there was no variance left, right? Both Democrats and Republicans were at such a low level of thinking that the women's place was in the home that the ANES basically said, we're not going to ask this question anymore because this is not telling us anything anymore. And so in 2022, Nathan Calmo, my co-author, and I decided to ask the question again just to see, was it still like that? Because they stopped asking it. And what we found in our 2022 data with a slightly differently worded question, but not that different, agree, disagree, women are better suited for taking care of the home than working in a job. All of a sudden, something has changed. And Republicans are basically back up to their 1980 levels of thinking women should stay in the home. Democrats actually get slightly more conservative on this issue as well. That might be it might be due to somewhat of the question wording, but it also might just be an actual trend that's happening among Democrats in their gender attitudes. This is hard to read, but I'll explain it. This is from the General Social Survey, which does a survey every 2 years. Also free online if you are interested in downloading data. This is the question of it's better for a man to work and for women to stay in the home. That red line there is the 50% line, and basically what we see is between 1975 and 2023, we see Democrats basically going from 10% thinking this to up to disagreeing with the statement, all the way up to almost half of Democrats disagreeing with the statement. Republicans sort of stay generally where they had been. They get slightly bit more progressive by the end of it, but not a whole lot. And this is it wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relations? So LGBT equality questions. This is the percentage of people saying it's not wrong at all. For Democrats and Republicans, we see in 1970 it was about 10% of them saying it's not wrong at all. And by 2023, we're up to about 75% of Democrats saying it's not wrong at all. Republicans do become more progressive on this, but they're falling behind Democrats, about 35%. Okay, so what we're seeing here is just sort of pictures of a trend, right? This is these ideas about the traditional social hierarchy, about what kind of equality, what kind of social equality we should have as a country, and who deserves kind of the full rights and protections of American citizenship. These attitudes diverging over time. And it's partly because Democrats have become a lot more progressive and Republicans are lagging behind them. But that hides a bit of a sub-trend within Republicans, which is that there's a growing divide within the Republican Party about these attitudes. So on average, these attitudes are becoming more progressive among Republicans, but it's not because every Republican is becoming more progressive, it's because there's a divergence. A lot of Republicans are becoming a lot more progressive, and others are actually turning away from it. And so this is data from fall of 2023. This is just distributions of attitudes. So this is called this patriarchy scale. Basically, women are better suited for taking care of the home than working in a job. And we reverse code. Women should have as many leadership positions as men. And on the left, you see this is just the distribution of attitudes across this scale for Democrats, and they're clustered at the zero end of the patriarchy scale. Over 40% of them scored the lowest possible level is at a 0. For Republicans, you see a much more normal distribution. So we actually have people agreeing with the, women should take care of the home. We do have Republicans who really disagree, who look like Democrats, but we also have Republicans who are kind of further out into the end of sort of approving of patriarchal society. If we look at Christian nationalism, which we measured as Christian beliefs should influence everything our government does, and then reverse-coded religious groups should generally stay out of politics. Again, what we see, Democrats on the left, overwhelmingly at the lowest possible score for Christian nationalism, Republicans all over the place, right? Varying levels of agreement with these statements. And then finally, replacement theory, which is recent immigration's part of a plan to replace white Christian Americans with other groups. Again, Democrats clustered at the very low end, almost 60% of them, and Republicans varying in their levels of disagreement or agreement with this statement. So even in kind of relatively recent data, we see this as a real divide between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are generally more unified in their feelings about these social equality issues. Republicans have a lot more kind of range of attitudes about these things. And the first question that you might ask is, why do we care, right? Why do we care about these kind of differing attitudes? What does this have to do with our, our democracy, with our, the sort of the state of our government? And the most important thing for me is that these attitudes tend to be correlated with approval of political violence in general. So people, you can ignore the top line, but people who have, believe that, women should stay in the home, people who believe we should be a Christian nation, people who believe in replacement theory, they're all significantly correlated with their approval of political violence, that political violence question that we asked before. So it's not just that these are, unequal attitudes, it's that these are disruptive attitudes, right? They are associated with some level of approval of violence in American politics and the political process. We also, so it's not only attitudes about violence, we've also been tracking actual threats that people receive. This is not from me, but the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton, they have some really fascinating data. This is really hard to read, but basically these are the threats that have targeted local officials. They did a survey of local officials and they asked them whether they had been receiving threats from random people. And so the green, this is the sort of the makeup of the types of threats they receive. The green part is racist threats. The blue is anti-LGBTQ threats. The yellow is anti-religious, which is mostly anti-Semitic. Purple is sexist, and then everything else is like other or unknown. But what we're seeing is these, a lot of these threats are coming through using basically racist, sexist language to threaten the people that they're calling. And these are not, they're calling local elected officials in their local or state government and threatening them. The percentage of threats that local government officials have received has increased basically tenfold since 20 years before. It is increasingly scary to be a local elected official, and this is part of the reason why. We also know this is from the CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So we want to look at real actual violent events on the ground. They've tracked actual terrorist attacks and plots, and what they found is across time, in recent years, really starting in around 2008, kind of maybe around when Obama was elected, we see a large increase in far right. This blue is the violent far right attacks, terrorist attacks. The green is violent far left, and the red is religious. And so what we see actually on the ground is that the amount of violence that we're seeing, political violence, domestic terrorism, although Democrats and Republicans in the public have relatively similar levels of approval of political violence, the acts that we're actually seeing people do are largely coming from the right. And so the question is why, right? Why do we have, this sort of escalation in violent attitudes, but sort of a bipartisan way? Clearly, we're partly having these, we feel this way about each other because we're disagreeing about really difficult things to talk about. And yet we see the sort of the most violence in actual practice coming from the right. So one thing I wanted to know was what's happening within the Republican Party that is allowing this kind of process to occur. And we've been collecting data really in multiple waves, but this is data from 2020. This is last spring, so this year. Basically looking at, there's a difference between kind of the Republicans who have the more traditionalist social equality values and the Republicans who have the more progressive social equality values. That is correlated with their beliefs about who won the 2020 election, for example. If we look at the difference between Republicans who believe that Trump won the 2020 election, that's the red bar, that Biden won the 2020 election, that's the purple bar, and then just the blue bar is Democrats and independents. It's everybody who's not a Republican. What we see is that there are differences between these groups of people. So on the far left, it's this is called social dominance orientation. It's basically believing that inequality is okay. It's probably a good thing that certain groups are at the top and other groups are at the bottom. There, the Republicans who believe that Biden won they look much more like Democrats than they do like the Republicans who think Trump won. Women are better suited to taking care of the home than working in a job. Again, the Republican election deniers look different from both the Republican election believers and everyone else. Christian beliefs should influence everything our government does. Here, they're sort of in between. They're in between the Republican election deniers and Democrats and independents, everyone else. And then finally, this is one of the items in the racial resentment scale. Irish, Italian, and Jewish ethnicities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Black Americans should do the same without any special favors. Here, the election denier Republicans are the highest on this, and the Republicans who don't think that Trump won are in between kind of the Democrats and the election deniers. So there seems to be some qualitative difference between the Republicans who believe in kind of the big lie and everyone else. And this is also worrisome because when we ask about whether it's important to accept the outcome of elections, even when your candidate loses, I'll start from the right here, right? 80% of Democrats agree. 79, so basically the exact same number of Republicans who believe that Biden won in 2020 agree. And the Republican election deniers are much, much lower in believing that it's important to accept the outcome of elections even when their preferred candidate loses. Even though they believe that their preferred candidate won in 2020, they're more skeptical about kind of the peaceful transfer of power if they don't get what they want. So again, let me check my time. Great. So again, we have this kind of you can sort of see this emerging rift within the Republican Party. It's not just that Democrats have these progressive views and Republicans have these kind of regressive views. It's that within the Republican Party, there's a divide between the Republicans who have increasingly progressive views and Republicans who kind of want to go back and undo a lot of the progress that we've made and even have less support for kind of the democratic process. And it's important to pay attention to these people because, going back to that graph I showed you earlier, the Republicans who are low in racial resentment are some of the most tolerant people in all of our samples. They don't dehumanize, they don't vilify, they don't say the Democrats are a threat to the country. Also, when it comes to hostile sexism, right? The Republicans who are the lowest in hostile sexism are also they're more tolerant than the Democrats, right here. They're more tolerant than the Democrats who are high in racial resentment. So they're uniquely tolerant of their political opponents. And the same here with sexism. So this is a really important group of people to pay attention to, and I think that they often get lumped in with the rest of the party in a way that is not necessarily helpful, and they really are sort of still like trying to hold down the fort of being the kind of traditional Republican Party, even though they're basically at this point a third of the Republican electorate nationally. So in terms of solutions, what makes these things better? How do we reduce people's approval of violence overall? We did a couple of experiments where we had people just read one sentence from either Donald Trump or Joe Biden that condemns violence. These are actual things that they had said. They're outside of the context of what they said, but basically in the Charlottesville speech, Donald Trump did say, "I condemn in the strongest possible terms all acts of violence." And Biden has said many times violence is, because of political opponents, because of political opinions, is never acceptable. And what we found in both times we did this experiment is that when people read the anti-violence message from either Trump or Biden, they become less approving of violence than the people who didn't read anything at all. So the gray bar is people who don't read anything. The blue bar is people who read one of those two statements. And what we find is that they're willing to step back from approving of violence after a very, very simple nudge, right? All they did was read like one sentence that somebody said. And they become different than the people who never heard that. And then the final thing that we did was, we think about violence as counter-normative. We should not have violence in a democratic system, certainly in the democratic process. And so one of the things that has changed is that the norms about violence, the acceptability of violence, have been changing. And so one thing we wanted to try to do was try to bring back those norms for people, just try to remind them of what we're supposed to think, what it used to be polite to think. And so the way we decided to do that was to ask people to think about their favorite school teacher from their childhood. Your school teacher is the one who teaches you how to be a person in a community. Your parents teach you how to be a person in a family, but your teacher teaches you when you're in a room full of strangers, how do you behave? What are the rules? What are the standards? And so we asked people, half of our sample, to think about their teacher and then ask what do you think they would think. One of our problems is that men didn't have favorite teachers, so it didn't really work for men. Some of them did, but not enough. And so I'm going to show you the results broken down by gender. Basically, what we found was that on the left, that's for women. When they were asked to think about their teacher, people approved of violence less than the people who were not asked to think about anybody. So it does seem like this is sort of a vague kind of reminder of what social norms are. Even just that does seem to have connected with people in a way that made them less approving of violence, because that's not normative, right? Our favorite teacher would not want us to be violent in order to achieve our political goals. Again, because of the lack of effect, the full sample, it didn't work, but it did for women too. So to finish off, based on all of these data, one thing I think that would help going forward is that, first of all, it's really important to identify and prioritize the conservative voices who are still engaged in the project of a multi-ethnic pluralistic democracy. And they're there, and they're actually, we've done a number of interviews, we've done a number of sort of qualitative studies in addition to our quantitative work. They're a substantial faction of the party, and they want to just do normal government, but they're being sidelined by a lot of their fellow partisans. One thing we're working on is trying to strengthen these sub-identities in the Republican Party that are really trying to counter the anti-pluralist movement within the Republican Party, because they are uniquely qualified to do so. But it's really important that we do that carefully, because these people are often the targets of threats and violence. They receive a lot of threats when they speak out loud about this. The meetings we've had with officials that are talking to us about this have to be completely off the record and secret, because they're very worried that they're going to be targeted. Most of them have been targeted already with threats. We need to have more leadership. So leadership from both the political parties and from the political media that reminds us that we are a pluralistic democracy, that we are a multi-ethnic democracy, and that type of democracy is the thing that we want to be. And that type of leadership is not, it's not trying to reinforce laws, right? We're talking about restoring norms. And so laws are enforced with law enforcement. Norms are enforced with us, right? Everybody around you in society enforces norms. If you do something bad or you do something counter-normative, then you will end up receiving messages back from the people around you that was not a good thing to do. And that feeling, shame, which is not always a great emotion, but it's a very powerful emotion. And it's powerful because it's the only way that we enforce social norms. It's the only thing that we have. And importantly, an in-group messenger is essential. So if there's a group that's doing something bad, you need someone from within the group to say, no, I disavow this. This is not how I think that our group should be behaving. So we need people within the group to police the boundaries and the norms of that group. And then finally, we all have a role to play, right? This is, if our leaders won't do this, then it's up to us as members of communities and as members of society to enforce those anti-violent norms in the places that we are. So remembering that if somebody starts speaking in a way that sounds pro-violence, we all have the job of trying to remind them that that's counter-normative. We don't have that type, in a democracy, we don't solve problems with violence. We have peaceful transfer of power, etc. So there is something about, I think, because a lot of our leaders are not actually stepping up, that it's up to all of us to try to remember that those norms disappear unless we enforce them. And I'm going to stop there.
We have about 20 minutes for some Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off. I'm going to ask you about something you didn't talk about.
Yeah.
I think. You did talk about media and leadership being really important. But and the reason I'm thinking about this is Ashley Parker, one of my favorite columns, wrote a nice piece this morning. You can watch the post if you read it, about the dark, dystopic, imaginary worldview of Donald Trump, where people get assaulted on their way to the store, immigrants are eating pets, there's going to be World War III if he's not reelected. That dark worldview, it strikes me, is one that would then lead people to accept violence to prevent that outcome, right? And it's echoed in the media as well. But it's detached from actual facts on the ground, where your crime rates are going down and immigrants aren't eating pets and things like that. But so that's a media problem, right? So I wonder if you've looked at the media as being integral in this idea of accepting a dystopic worldview and that then justifying violence.
Right. Right. So the media are a huge part of this. And I don't think it's an accident that we sort of saw a lot of this partisan animosity really start to increase in the 1990s and early 2000s. And Fox News didn't exist until 1996. So just the idea of even having a partisan media wasn't really feasible until not that long ago. And increasingly, and I think this is largely because of Fox, although now it's spread to other media sources that are also trusted within the sort of far right-wing media ecosystem. The way that our political leaders seem to prioritize attention is that they want the attention of the media. They want the attention of the partisan media, which will then translate down to getting votes from their constituents. But they don't target the constituents directly. And so they're more worried about Fox News getting mad at them about a decision they made than they are about their constituents getting mad at them about a decision they made, because if Fox doesn't talk about it, the constituents don't know about it, and they won't get punished. And so the accountability structure, I think, has really changed, where when I said leadership, it should be elected officials that are the leaders, but media is hugely powerful in being opinion leaders, and they often have more authority than elected officials in kind of determining the way that voters are behaving. In terms of the imaginary world part, this is like a tried and true authoritarian tactic, right? You create a false crisis, you make it seem like you find a scapegoated, subgroup that exists that is usually innocent but vulnerable and can't defend themselves, and you present them as a threat to everyone who's not them. And that kind of thing, that's where it gets very worrisome, because it really is just a classical tyrannical kind of authoritarian approach to convincing the electorate to join a more extremist political movement. And extremist political movements, I think it is interesting. Extremist political movements can be really, really comforting to be part of, because in a time of uncertainty, you have certainty, right? The extremist movement gives you very strong boundaries. You know exactly what your job is. You know exactly what the rules are. And people who feel uncertain tend to be attracted to extremist groups pretty frequently. The problem with those groups is that once you join the group, it's very hard to come back to normal society because the group makes you break a lot of norms that normal society has. And so once you're in the extremist group, it's very hard to come back and still think you're a good person. And that's just this work from, getting people out of cults and sociology and that type of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's an attractive space to be, even if it's fake. It feels certain, and people can feel confident being in that group. And then whatever the leader needs them to do after that, it's pretty easy to get them to do.
Did you have an equal number of respondents, male and female, in the groups? And did you see any gender differences?
Yeah, so all these samples were matched to the census on all the demographics. So basically, it's 50-50 men and women.
And you had the same number of respondents, male and female.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was like half the sample.
Okay.
In some of them, I think the census was actually 51% female or something, but the women are less approving of violence overall, as are people who are wealthier and people who are more educated, because they are invested in the status quo, right? They don't want to disrupt things because they're doing great. Also, older people are less supporting of violence. So there are demographic differences, but overall, everyone responds to these kind of interventions in the same way.
It's just a question about something puzzling within the data at the beginning of the presentation where you showed us the social attitudes of both Democrats and Republicans. So focusing specifically on Democrat data that you showed us, like the A and ES and the 538 stuff, we see like, I'll never simplify to say like more socially progressive, so like post-Obama, like the Democrats are continually more progressive when it comes to racial issues, and it was the same with the same-sex relationships. But there was a spike back up in the women's roles, like going in the opposite directions. So one, like what do you think it is about this specific issue of women's roles versus like other potentially more like progressive issues that could come within the same like barrel? And then secondly, you mentioned with this one that they stopped running the survey in 2008, and then you reran it out with different questions. So from a research design perspective, is there a reason you reworded the question instead of just running the same question out to like account for that?
Right. So So they didn't stop doing the survey; they just stopped asking the questions in the survey. And I mean, the simple answer is that takes a long time for people to read, and this takes shorter time for people to read, and you pay for surveys based on the time it takes people. So I mean, we were, it's not like an intentional design choice. It was just sort of trying to get at the general sense of it. But the thing is that strangely, we actually see in the GSS data, right? It seems more gradual. This is only strongly disagreeing that women should stay in the home, and so it's more gradual when you just look at the strongly disagree option. But here we have the average position, right, ranging between 0 and 1, and so. And what happened between 2008 and 2020 in the ANES, I don't know, right? I mean, there has been an increasingly prevalent misogynistic movement, right? We have like the incels emerge during that period of time, so it's possible that Democrats are kind of going back. And also, like I showed with the other figure, right? Democrats, their level of sexism doesn't affect how they think about Republicans, so they're not really applying it to their like political understanding of the world. And also, just I think anecdotally, we've seen plenty of misogyny coming from the Democratic Party throughout most of our primaries, and all. Whenever women candidates are kind of running against male candidates, we see a lot of misogyny emerge. So I think it's been in the Democratic Party. It's not as prevalent, and people aren't willing to talk about it as much. But I think it's I think that there has been movement in recent years towards more misogyny on both parties.
Bernie Bros.
Yeah, they're Bernie Bros. Yeah,
Bernie Bros.
That's a lot to counter. Like I'm sure that spike would exist. I don't know if it would be quite as steep as it is with the question wording changing, because it seems to me that the initial question frames it as an equality issue, and the second question frames it as an inherent trait, and those are fundamentally different questions.
Right. Although you would, I see what you're saying.
Like one is around an actual role, and one is around like an assumed characteristic of femininity.
Yeah. Women's places in the home. Yeah, I guess. That's true. I mean, the thing is that we didn't say the word equal.
Yes.
in the later question, and I think that might have made it a little easier
Yeah.
to disagree.
Exactly.
But no, you're right. I mean, and the change is small enough that it could just be a survey artifact. I mean, it doesn't necessarily.
That is not to deny in any way that we are seeing, of course, this kind, and especially in Gen Z, this kind of like, throughout like generational differences. But we are seeing a division in maybe masculine and feminine preferences around politics. So.
Right. We have the gender gap is the largest among Gen Z than it is anyone else.
I'm just sort of adding on to this. It might just be a bit too anecdotal, but from what I can remember growing up around this time when this spike started happening, around that time there was a lot of, feminists being portrayed as hysterical almost, or theatrical in their concerns, or like, oh, look at these crazy feminist compilations, or look at this crazy SJW compilations, like stuff like that, where these kids who are growing up with all this churned out YouTube content at the time weren't around long enough to know why people were fighting for their rights and why sexism is such an issue, because they didn't grow up with those same they didn't grow up with so much structural failure that previous generations did. They only grew up with this, it feels like almost like a resurgence of the whole back when if a woman had feelings then she was just called hysterical and dismissed for it. And now if you have concerns then that's hysterical, or it's woke. I don't even know what that word means anymore.
Yeah. No, it's a really good point, and I think it reminds me of another point to make, which is it's really important for us to remember how fast our equality has increased across all groups. It's not fast in a human lifetime, but it is fast historically. And my mom, my own mother couldn't get a bank account without her husband's permission until she was 28 years old. So I'm not that old. It is sort of, LGBTQ rights are a great example of this, right? Just so rapid, such a rapid increase. The changes in, the movement for Black Lives Matter, right, really emerged in 2013, 14, 15. And so a lot, and that's exactly the same time when when gay marriage was legalized by the Supreme Court. So really, in the last 10 years, we've seen a huge amount of social progress. And one way to think about this is not only that are young people not really noticing how delicate that is, right? How recent it is, and how easy it is for that to disappear. But I think also, and maybe taking it for granted. But I think also what we're seeing is a real backlash to this progress, and an act, not just not knowing that it could disappear, but actually wanting it to disappear. And the amount of progress and the speed with which it occurred it's almost, if you imagine a hypothetical place that had that type of progress, it's almost inevitable that there would be backlash, right? And people don't give up power peacefully and voluntarily. So it's almost not, I think in my most optimistic moments, I think this is the part we have to get through, right? This progress has happened. It disturbed a lot of people and they're freaking out about it. And maybe we can, if we can kind of keep the wheels on the car and keep going, then we'll get past it. But we will have to live through a backlash at some point anyway, because so much progress has been made. The question is whether the backlash wins and we kind of go back to the time when things were not as equal as they are now. But yeah, I think it's really important to remember that this is recent. This progress has been very recent, and a lot of people, young people, don't know about it or don't remember a time before it existed. And I think a lot of older people don't like it. Yeah.
So you talked about a bunch of different measures of attitude that are correlated with approval of violence. You showed Christian nationalism, replacement theory, opinions on women's role. Is there a certain attitude you think is more correlated with this kind of approval of violence, or do they all go hand in hand?
So I think the conceptual, theoretical answer is all of these ideas about putting groups of people in their place have to inherently approve of some type of violence, because you can't oppress a group of people without the threat of violence. They just won't listen to you. And so all of those types of attitudes are, here, let's see if I even go back to the, where was the Castillo? There. I mean, if you think about, oppressing women or Black Americans or immigrants, right? All of those movements require some element of, if you don't listen to me, then this will be the consequence. I don't think that any of them are necessarily more associated with violence in general. The one thing about Christian nationalism that I will say is that there is a sort of like a theology of, within Christian nationalism, there is sort of a theology of fighting, right? Sort of fighting evil, fighting back, taking back our place, and it's not because of the religion; it's because of the political part of that movement that is very much about kind of restoring our dominion over the way that things should be. And so I think that might be associated with political violence attitudes, maybe slightly for a different reason, because there is a whole theology involved that people are listening to, and it's not necessarily about the attitude, it's about the movement. But in general, yeah, they're all kind of equally. Yeah.
On your solution slide there, you had about encouraging subgroups within the GOP sub-identities. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? Because to me, I think of the groups within the GOP and kind of, if there's a resentment, attitude, and then there's kind of the traditional low taxes, regulation, but that's not really an identity, that's more of a policy demand.
Yeah.
And if I think of like communitarian, they're actually some of the least pluralistic, if you're looking at like a Patrick Deneen or something.
Yeah.
So who are what are they offering to people maybe who are currently in the resentment identity group? What are they offering in terms of a positive identity?
So far what I've been able to gather from this group of people is that they just want things to work. They want to do government the way, they want to do their basic job. It's like looking at the House of Representatives, for example, right? Like the kind of more Trumpy movement in the House is basically just chaos. It's for chaos.
Is that an identity?
No, but I think that the group that doesn't want chaos is increasingly an identity. Because what we know about how identities are born is that they are often born out of threat, right? So you don't think about yourself as a member of a group until somebody threatens that group, and then you're like, hey, hold on a second, right? Like you're sitting here, you don't necessarily think about yourself in this very moment right now as a person from your hometown. But if I were to say everyone from your hometown is an idiot, then you'd be like, oh, hold on, right? Like, so then I just created that identity for everyone in the room. And so this group of Republicans, the one thing I do see that they have in common is that they feel very much threatened by their own political party. They feel threatened by people in their own party. And they're scared of people in their own party and the way that those people are going to treat them, both socially and physically. Like they're worried about their physical safety and also just whether they fit in with their social group. So, I mean, there's a common grievance in that subgroup, and there is a sense of threat for sure. And those two things generally make an identity. I haven't seen them actually act like they have a common identity yet.
Do you think they have anything to offer to the people? You're saying like 2/3.
Yeah.
If we think of like the party as a, mainstreams identities or policy demands, and does it offer anything to them?
What they would say is what they have to offer is a functioning government and support for the democratic process. So no more chaos, no more election chaos, no more trying to burn
the other
everything down.
2/3 is like that.
They're not interested in it.
Yeah,
I know.
that wasn't working for us previously.
I know. Well, and the other thing is that they're this group of Republicans is more likely to have a diverse social network, so they know Democrats, they've met Democrats before, and they consume different media than the kind of more right-wing Republicans do. So they're actually sort of living in a different universe. Like they're living in an informational space that's distinct from the rest of the party. And when you're in that situation, you can't speak across an informational divide. It's really hard to do that. The only thing that I would say is that they don't necessarily need to offer something and pull people back in, but as a third of the party, they won't win a primary, but they can certainly change the outcome of a general election. And so the party can't risk losing them either. And so by alienating them, they really are. I mean, the party is deciding to alienate a third of their own coalition. That's a huge amount of voters to anger and turn off.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm afraid we're out of time.
All right, thank you for all the great questions.